My name is Urak Nakenga, and welcome to Connecting People with Policy. Today we have Ashley DUCRE, the host of Legally Speaking. Hi, Ashley. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
So, Ashley, for those who may not know you, can you give a little bit background of who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a real estate professional from Annapolis, Maryland. I am a mom of four, and I have an interest in broadcast media. I co-founded a radio station, Power 99.1 Annapolis, and our newest endeavor is our podcast, Legally Speaking, which focuses on prison reform and social justice.
Okay, so before we get into your work with Legally Speaking, can you elaborate more on what sparked you into your original career?
Sure. Well, what sparked me into my original career was as a young child, we had struggles with homelessness and eviction, and I always wanted to prevent that in my community. And so becoming a realtor was the best way for me to change things in my community, increase homeownership in my community, and also prevent homelessness.
So what was it that shifted you from real estate into being a host for a growing podcast, to say the least?
Yes. Well, I've always had an interest in broadcast media. During my years in college, I started a community radio station, and I was on a local radio station, WPB Radio. And from there, I branched off into online radio. And I've just always enjoyed broadcast media. I love music, so that was a no-brainer. But the podcast is our newest venture. And I'm new in the realm of social justice and prison reform, but I'm not new to broadcast media. So I'm trying to merge the two together for our podcast with Spotify.
It doesn't seem like you're new to it, because I was listening to even one of your podcasts, and in one of the episodes you spoke about how your father was in prison and so forth. Mm-hmm. So how do you think your father being in prison kind of shaped you into who you are and what you do now?
Sure. Well, growing up, to be honest, I was very ashamed that my father was incarcerated. I believe that my grandmother was ashamed too. She is very conservative. She was a Black Republican. Mm-hmm. So, and my father is her only child, and I am her only grandchild. So growing up, my grandmother always told me that my father was away in school and he was in college and studying. So when I first got the opportunity to meet my father when he was released from prison, one of the first times, I was expecting, a very sophisticated gentleman, but he was not that. So that's when I started to kind of question my grandmother about my father's past. And my father was very vocal about his past once he came home. But from there, unfortunately, he became incarcerated many times after that. So I used to assist my grandmother with writing appeals and motions on my father's behalf. Once my father became vocal about being in prison and my grandmother knew that I knew, I then began to visit him. And sadly, the conditions of the prisons were so dilapidated. It was just a shock, to see that all of these men are in here. The conditions are so poor. And I thought about it a lot, but it didn't really do much for me as a child. Now, being an adult and kind of looking back on it, I see that there, is a lot of room for reform and change and advocacy in that realm. And so that's what really sparked my interest.
Did that take a toll on you and your father's relationship with him being in and out of prison?
Yes, most definitely. I honestly did not have a relationship with my father. It wasn't until he was released from prison maybe about 13 years ago where I sponsored him at my house on home detention. And I really honestly just did it so that I could be close to him and get to know him. But then that's when I was introduced to how you can become institutionalized. Yeah. Some of the ways that my father was living were just really strange to me. Even though he had a bed, he was comfortable sleeping on the floor. He saved jugs and things that you would normally do in prison. He did a lot of that in the free world. And honestly, he wasn't as polished as I would like him to be or what I thought he was going to be coming out of prison. So I think, the effects that it has, of course, it varies because we're all individuals. But
Yeah.
I was just expecting my father to be, straight and narrow, a totally different person. But sadly, his, trajectory was a little different.
Yeah, and I also think it's important because especially like being Black women and growing up and wanting or needing that father figure, we
Yes.
kind of like minimize the impact that it can have on us,
Yes.
And you're a mother yourself, correct?
I am. I'm a mother of 4.
So how do you feel that your relationship with your father, how does that navigate with your relationship with your kids now that you're grown, you have 4 kids, them witnessing you do what you do and everything like that. So how do you think that plays a role?
I think the biggest role that it played is I was kind of gung-ho on picking a partner that was, in my mind, a good guy and, didn't have any trouble with the law. And when we started our family, we were high school sweethearts, and we started a family too early, in my opinion, now that
Yeah.
now that I have an 18-year-old. But we started our family in 2005, and it was important to me, number one, to just try to keep my boyfriend then, but, husband, out of trouble, try to support him the best way that I could, financially, because I didn't want him to go down a path of, possibly selling drugs or doing things like that to support our family. So it was really important to me to try to, I guess, govern him a little because I didn't really know what caused my father to go down the path that he went down. Yeah. My grandmother was pretty well off, so there was not a direct need for my father to commit some of the crimes that he committed. So I was just trying to understand, like, where did the corruption come from with my father, and how do I prevent it with, my children's father?
Yeah,
And
like trying to find like the root of it.
yes,
Yeah.
because my children's father was raised in a low income, community, I guess what's known as like the projects, in Maryland. So he was exposed to a lot of the things that my father willingly exposed himself to.
Yeah.
And I just, wanted to protect him as best I could.
Just as a side note, because as I'm hearing your story, I kind of resonate with it just a little bit. So do you feel like sometimes as Black women, we take on a role that, like outside roles in a sense, because the way that you're describing it gives very much like motherly, like
Yes.
protection and like weight on your shoulders. Do you feel like sometimes we find ourselves victim to that?
I do. I feel as Black women, sometimes we take on more than we should. And I also feel like that me governing and trying to, be that driving force,
Yeah.
ultimately is kind of what led to my divorce because, men want to be men and you have to allow them to grow and make their own mistakes and not try to have your own objective for their lives based on your trauma. And I think that's what I was doing.
So I want to navigate the conversation more into like prison reform, specifically within the U.S. system. So as you know, the U.S. right now is home to less than 5% of the world's population, yet nearly 16% of all incarcerated people. So we're leading in prison incarcerament. Why do you think that is?
I honestly think that it's from a lack of education and a lack of support within the community. When we look at the communities that are affected most by incarceration, most of them are in the Black and brown communities, if we're being honest. And a lot of those people are raised by single mothers who don't have a lot of time to maybe put their child in sports or kind of govern them a little better. And I think that's where, hanging with friends and peer pressure comes in, and it will, ultimately lead to crime, committing crimes, and possibly selling drugs, depending on the neighborhood that you're in. And I think it really just all attests to fathers not being in the home, in a sense. I think if more fathers were in the home, that it would kind of create a better sense of protection for young Black males. But that's just my opinion on it.
It's funny you bring that up because a lot of people that, when it comes to this topic, and when people bring up we need more fathers in the homes as an example, it's usually used as like, oh, you're making excuses for what the system failed to do, sort of say. So how much of it do you think is self-responsibility, and how much of it do you believe that we're not doing enough as a country to provide those resources for those to grow up in a solid foundational home?
I think honestly, it's about evenly split at about 50-50. You know, we do have a self-responsibility to govern ourselves accordingly and follow the law and try to do what's best. But I also feel as though it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
So I try to lead with grace, you know, in that realm to not judge. But I do feel as though if fathers were in the home or just more active, because I know things happen where, you know, parents separate, you know, things aren't perfect. But again, that presence, even if we could possibly push for more mentorship programs for young boys or bring back the community rec centers, things like that, you know, in the sense of change will be a lot better for young Black males instead of having other wounded, you know, young boys try to heal others.
No, I feel that 100%. And that's something that I advocate for because I'm a product of a mentorship program. So I really, truly believe like when we invest in our community, we see the results of that. And I do think that's something that we do lack in the U.S. system, that we're not willing to invest in our community, even outside from like mentorship programs, like something as like the student loan conversation, like people, like stuff like that. It's like when we invest in our people, that's where we see results and solutions.
Yes, I agree.
So now we're going to pivot into private prisons. In your podcast, you speak about how many Wall Street banks still finance private prisons and use financial tools to do so. So how have financial tools enabled private prisons to expand their businesses?
I think they've enabled them to grow, but not in the way that they should be growing. And what I mean by that, I honestly feel as though the financing that is poured into the private prison system is mostly to line the pockets of investors and board members and not to actually focus on the institution itself. When I look at the payroll and budgets and the overall conditions of the prisons, you can see that money is not being poured in or properly allocated in the sense. But when you look at the stakeholders and equity stake of the companies that are, and even some celebrities that have been investing into those companies, it's a great investment, you know, from the sense of the ROI, the return on the investment that the investors are getting, but they're not living up to the business plan and the core, you know, model for the business. Because if we're talking equity stake and things like that, then it is a business. So, you know, they do have a responsibility to adhere to the business plan and the goals. And I feel as though they do not. It's kind of a way to honestly steal money in a sense. They, you know, are obtaining these government contracts and getting the funding, but nothing is going towards the inmates or the payroll, the staffing.
And they deem it as modern day slavery as what they compare it to as well.
Yes. And even when I look at some of the vendors that they partner with, you know, in regards to healthcare, food service, they're still spending pennies on the dollar, you know, for food. So I read an article that, you know, the prison systems tried to keep the daily food budget per inmate to about 80 cents to 125 cents per day. Mm-hmm. And when I went onto the website for the biggest company that provides food for the private prison sector, they have so many options that can be used and better dieting plans, but they go for the things that are the cheapest, and in some cases inhumane. There have been articles stating that some of the food that they've found in private prison systems have showed that it's not even for human consumption.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Do you think that we can sometimes be enables certain behavior in a sense? Because like when we talk about those who are invested in private prisons or investing their money into private prisons, we have people like everyday people, us, like buying the product of the big investors, you know what I'm saying? So can that kind of play like both sides of how we enable such behavior?
I do agree. And I also think that when we're talking about celebrities investing in it, that they have a business manager or a portfolio manager that's kind of just suggesting, companies. And when you hear some of the company names, you may not know that they are, in the private prison sector. When we look at the GEO Group, it's just me hearing that name, I wouldn't think that they would be one of the top leaders of private institutions. When we look at Core Civic, I wouldn't think that that name, would be connected, but it is. And I think sometimes people with money blindly invest, or they are just looking to diversify their portfolio and
make more money.
Yep, and make more money, and not focusing on, the objective behind it and being responsible with investing.
Okay, so now we're gonna speak more about like the actual prison reforming. What are your current thoughts on the current administration and how they're navigating prison reform? Do you think that they're doing enough? Do you think they're not highlighting it enough, or they should be doing more? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I am excited that last year Colette Peters was sworn in as the new director of the Bureau of Prisons. She is. She has a background running the Oregon State detention centers, and she does have a background in reform, and also she is against the federal death penalty and has been able to provide some reform in that nature. So I do feel as though things are on the up and up. But then when we look at bipartisan acts such as the First Step Act, there could be a lot more to be explored in that area. There were a lot of inmates that qualified for it, but because of the lack of staffing and just the overall lack of care and professionalism, the points needed to reduce sentences and kind of let certain inmates out that qualified, they didn't receive that. And so I think that there still is a big part of reform that is needed. But I think that Colette Peters is definitely the woman for the job. Before that, I believe it was Michael Clavinall who resigned abruptly under the Trump administration. And for a while, the BOP didn't have a director. So I think we are starting to see some change under the Biden administration. But I think that there's a lot of cleanup that has to be done, and it's no easy task, I'm sure.
Yeah. What specifically do you think is like lacking that we're missing, that it's not clicking currently to like get the ball rolling? Because sorry to interrupt, but like in my personal opinion, I feel like we should be moving faster than what we're doing right now.
Yes, I would honestly say the basics of just lack of personnel. I think honestly the federal government needs to be more aggressive with hiring and staffing and making sure that, the prisons are able to run properly. A lot of the lockdowns that occur in the federal system are really just based off of lack of personnel and not enough, correctional officers to cover a shift. And when that's done, inmates are locked down for days at a time for no real reason. And I think, the administration needs to get more aggressive with filling those jobs, maybe doing more recruiting and focusing on just filling the position so that the federal government can run properly. But just like any company, if there's, no employees, things start to slip beside the wayside and things are just not done properly. And I think that's the biggest thing that they could do to make things better, is to properly staff all of the roles, in the Department of Justice and with the Bureau of Prisons so that work can effectively be done.
For sure. There's something that another topic that you spoke about on your podcast was about the prison book bans.
Yes.
What are people not aware of surrounding the prison book bans? Because this was even news to me specifically, because in the state of Texas, obviously we had the whole legislation piece around book bans and certain books that weren't going to be displayed in public schools and public libraries and so forth. But I didn't know that it was in prisons as well. So like, what are we not aware of?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that we are not aware of is exactly what books are banned. And the reason that we're not aware of it is because there's no protocol, there's no specific guideline. It's kind of at the discretion of the institution.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned in the podcast, there are even some instances where a book will be banned in one institution but able to come through in
a different
another.
one?
Yes. And then sometimes in the same institution, a book will be able to be pushed through and not seen as a threat, but then another personnel member will see it as a threat and ban it. So I think the lack of consistency is the biggest thing that we need to kind of be aware of, and kind of fighting for it in a sense of trying to advocate for the book bans to make sense. A lot of them don't make sense. Some of the books that I was looking at, I don't feel like they are a threat to security or to the overall prison. And I really think it's just a way to control and kind of oppress, in my opinion.
Another thing that you do on your podcast that's very like, wow, I don't know how you do it, is that you actually interview Federal Bureau inmates. Mm-hmm. So number one, how do you get to interview them? And then on top of that, like, is there anybody that you've interviewed to where their testimony just stuck with you? Like, wow.
Sure. So how it came about is I probably haven't mentioned before, I think that was during another conversation, but I wrote a letter on behalf of one of my classmates who's serving time in federal prison. And from there, I gained a lot of connections. But in my mind, I thought it was going to be as easy as, hey, just give this inmate the phone and let him speak to me. But, it's kind of a stricter guideline. I have to be added to their call list. And it's really a traditional call. I have about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the institution.
Oh my gosh.
And we try to cram it all in and interview them and tell their story the best way we can. And then from there, I have to send the copy of that audio to the warden and to a person that's connected to the Bureau of Prisons for them to review it. So right now, we have about 5 episodes now under review.
Oh my gosh.
They kind of are dragging their feet on it.
They take their time?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And they don't really see it as a priority, but I've still been welcoming inmates to connect with me, and it's really been word of mouth. One of the inmates that I connected with, he went through the transition center. So the Federal Bureau of Prisons has like a transition center in Oklahoma, FTC Oklahoma. And if you're being transferred, you go through there, I'm assuming, and then you go to your next place. So during that time, a lot of inmates got my contact information, and it's kind of been increasing. And
Period.
I wanna speak to as many people as possible. But then there are some, people that just aren't fit to, speak about the topics and just want to kind of,
get a break type of.
Yeah, get a break or maybe ask for money. So I started the Federal Inmate Fund, which is not an official nonprofit at all. It's just me honestly using my personal funds and maybe funds from my friends and family. And we provide funding for commissary, or we provide gifts to their loved ones. So a lot of inmates, of course, are fathers, and for holidays, they're not able, or not even holidays, back to school, birthdays, or just because they're not able to provide gifts. So if they add me to their core links, which is their email system in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and tell me what the money is used for, we will either add money to their commissary by Western Union for them to purchase the toiletries and items they need, or we've had a few gentlemen who have stated that their daughter is graduating or their son needs money for driving school. And so we've, donated on behalf of Legally Speaking, just as, my way to pay it forward, honestly.
Oh my gosh. You have a beautiful heart.
Oh, thank you.
So like what's next for you? So like you have this podcast, you're doing a lot, you're doing amazing by the way.
Oh,
What's
thank
next for
you.
Ashley DUCRE? DUCRE.
Sure. What's next for me is just continuing to educate myself, in this space. I'm so new to the social justice and prison reform space that I want to learn as much as I can. The episodes may seem seamless, but the podcast episodes, it's a lot of research and just trying to articulate it properly and
I learned a
still be
lot
like
from
fast, fun, and friendly so that I can keep the attention of everyone. So it's really just educating myself, being a role model and an advocate in my community is definitely a big part for me, and honestly continuing to connect with inmates, showing them that they are important, they are not forgotten about, and providing any support I can, whether it be financial. We've been sending books. So with the Federal Bureau of Prison, we can only send books from the publisher or from Amazon. So I send about maybe 10 to 15 books to different prisoners, just at random. They never know what book they're getting. So I've been lately sending one of Nipsey Hussle's latest books, and then Rick Ross wrote a book about business that I thought, and just kind of encouraging them. And I was keeping my fingers crossed after I read about the book banning, hoping that these they weren't on the list, but the inmates did receive them. So just continuing to push, love and grace through our podcasts and provide any support that we can is really my goal.
That's amazing. So where can people find you and how can they support?
Sure. Well, I can be found on Instagram and Threads at The Legal Speaks, and we are currently supporting a campaign with the Sentencing Project. We're looking to raise $100, so I would love your support in that realm. And I can be found on Spotify at Just Legally Speaking.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for coming. We'll be sure to have all the links in the description down below. Please be sure to press that subscribe button, turn on post notifications to be notified when we post another video. Until next time, this is Udoak with Connecting People with Policy.